In a small, dusty antique shop, there sat an old clock with a face cracked like an ancient mirror. The clock, once golden and gleaming, was now tarnished and grim, with hands that moved slowly, as if they carried the weight of centuries. The shopkeeper, Mr. Finch, had always found the clock unsettling, but he could never bring himself to sell it. "It's too peculiar," he would mutter to himself, glancing at it warily each time he passed by. One stormy night, a man with a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat walked into the shop, his eyes drawn immediately to the clock. "How much for that old thing?" the man asked, his voice deep and oddly melodic, like a sinister lullaby. Mr. Finch hesitated, then said, "It's not for sale, sir. That clock has a history you wouldn't want to bring home." The man chuckled darkly and leaned in closer to the clock, his breath fogging up the cracked glass face. "I know its history well, old man. That's why I want it." That night, as Mr. Finch closed up the shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by the clock. Its tick-tock echoed louder than usual, as if trying to communicate something only the night could understand. The next morning, Mr. Finch found the clock missing, with no sign of a break-in. The only clue was a single note, pinned to the counter with a rusted nail. "Time is on my side." Weeks passed and strange rumors began to circulate in the village about the man who had taken the clock. He was said to have moved into an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, where the clock could be heard ticking even from outside the locked gates. Curious villagers who ventured too close reported hearing strange noises from within the mansion, laughter, crying, and once, a blood-curdling scream. Yet, whenever someone knocked on the door, it would swing open to reveal only the empty, echoing halls of the mansion. One day, a little boy named Timmy, who loved to play near the mansion despite his mother's warnings, found himself drawn to the sound of the clock's ticking. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like a heartbeat in the silence of the afternoon. Timmy peered through a cracked window and saw the clock, its hands spinning wildly as if it was counting down to something terrible. He couldn't look away, mesmerized by the way the clock seemed to be alive, its tick-tock synchronizing with the pounding of his own heart. Suddenly, the door creaked open behind him, and Timmy felt a cold gust of wind push him inside. The door slammed shut, and the ticking grew louder, faster, almost frantic. Terrified, Timmy tried to escape, but every door and window was locked, trapping him in the house with the ticking clock. He could hear the clock's voice now, whispering in the dark, telling him things no child should ever know. Meanwhile, in the village, Timmy's mother grew frantic with worry when her son didn't return home. She gathered the villagers, and together they marched to the mansion, determined to bring Timmy back. When they arrived, they found the door wide open. Just as others had before, they called out for Timmy, but only the ticking of the clock answered them, its tone more ominous than ever. As they searched the mansion, they found the clock standing in the center of the main hall, its face glowing with an eerie light. The hands had stopped at midnight, and the entire house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Just as they were about to give up, they heard a soft whimper from behind the clock. Timmy was curled up in a ball, his eyes wide with fear, but he was unharmed. The villagers quickly took him home, but Timmy was never the same after that. He refused to speak of what he had seen, and the sound of a ticking clock would send him into fits of panic. The mansion was abandoned once more, but the clock remained, ticking away in the silence, as if mocking those who dared to challenge time itself. No one dared to go near it again, but some nights the villagers would hear its ominous tick-tock carried on the wind. Years passed, and the village tried to forget the horrors of the mansion and the clock. But time, as they say, waits for no one, and the clock was patient, biding its time until it found another soul to torment. One evening, an old traveler, unaware of the village's dark history, stumbled upon the mansion. He was weary from his journey and sought shelter, finding the door surprisingly easy to open. The moment he stepped inside, the clock's ticking greeted him, a welcome as cold as the wind that swept through the halls. The traveler, intrigued by the clock, approached it, noting the intricate details of its design. As he studied the clock, he noticed the hands beginning to move backward, the ticking growing faster and louder. He felt a strange sensation, as if time itself was unraveling around him, pulling him back through the years. Memories long forgotten flooded his mind, faces, places, moments of joy and sorrow, all blending together in a chaotic whirl. The traveler tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the floor, trapped by the clock's power. The room around him shifted, and suddenly, he was standing in the middle of a grand ballroom, filled with people dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The clock still ticked loudly in the background, but now it was the heartbeat of a different time, a different era. The traveler realized, with growing horror, that he had been pulled into the past, a prisoner of the clock's twisted sense of humor. The people in the ballroom moved in slow motion, their faces frozen in expressions of joy that didn't quite reach their eyes. But the damage was done, and the clock's curse had claimed another life. The teenagers fled the mansion, vowing to never speak of what they had witnessed. But the memory of the clock haunted them for the rest of their days. And so the clock remained, broken but not defeated, waiting for the day when it would be restored, and its cursed hands could once again turn. The village, now almost forgotten by the world, stood as a silent witness to the horrors of time and the cruel tricks it could play. The story of the clock became legend, a tale of warning passed down through the generations. But even as the years wore on, the villagers knew that the clock was still out there, biding its time, waiting for the next victim to wander into its grasp. For time, after all, is a relentless force, and the clock was its cruelest manifestation, a reminder that no matter how far you run, time will always catch up. In the years that followed, the village slowly faded from memory, its inhabitants moving away, leaving the cursed land to the elements. The mansion, once grand and imposing, was now little more than a crumbling ruin, overtaken by vines and the slow march of decay. Only the clock, broken and forgotten, remained as a silent sentinel amidst the rubble. One day, a group of historians, intrigued by the tales of the haunted village and its cursed clock, decided to pay a visit. They were scholars, skeptics by nature, who scoffed at the idea of a clock that could trap souls or turn back time. Armed with cameras and notebooks, they ventured into the mansion, eager to uncover the truth behind the legends. As they picked their way through the debris, they found the clock, half buried in dust and cobwebs. Its face was cracked, and the hands were still. But there was something about it that drew them in, a strange energy that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface. One of the historians, a man named Dr. Caldwell, brushed away the dust and carefully lifted the clock from the ground. "It's just an old piece of junk," he said with a laugh, "but perhaps we can restore it, get it working again for our collection." The others agreed, and they packed the clock away, not noticing the faint glow that flickered in its shattered face. They returned to their city, eager to begin their work, unaware that they had awakened something far more powerful than a mere artifact. In the days that followed, Dr. Caldwell worked tirelessly to repair the clock, piecing together its delicate mechanisms and polishing its tarnished surface. The more he worked on it, the more he became obsessed, driven by a need to see it whole again. He barely slept, his every thought consumed by the clock and its mysteries. Finally, after weeks of labor, the clock was restored to its former glory. Its golden casing gleamed, and the hands once again moved in perfect rhythm. Dr. Caldwell stood back to admire his work, a sense of triumph swelling within him as the clock began to tick once more. But as the clock's hands moved, a strange feeling settled over the room. The air grew heavy, charged with a tension that made the hairs on the back of Dr. Caldwell's neck stand on end. He glanced at the clock, and for the first time, he noticed that the ticking was not quite right, too fast, too eager, as if it was counting down to something dreadful. Before he could react, the clock's hands began to spin wildly, faster and faster, until they were a blur. The ticking grew louder, filling the room with a deafening roar. Dr. Caldwell staggered back, clutching his ears as the clock's face began to glow with an eerie light. Suddenly, the light exploded outward, engulfing the entire room. Dr. Caldwell felt himself being pulled, yanked out of time and space, his surroundings dissolving into a whirl of colors and sounds. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the chaos, swallowed by the relentless ticking. When the light finally faded, Dr. Caldwell found himself standing in the middle of a grand hall, its walls lined with mirrors and portraits. The clock was there, its face now intact, but its hands were still spinning, faster than ever. He looked around in confusion, trying to make sense of where he was, but nothing seemed real. The mirrors reflected not his own image, but 100 different versions of himself, young, old, happy, sad, every possible version of his life playing out before his eyes. As he stared, one of the mirrors caught his attention. It showed him as an old man, frail and hunched, sitting alone in a dark room, the clock ticking away the last moments of his life. He felt a chill of fear run through him as he realized that this was his future where the clock would eventually claim him, just as it had claimed so many others. Desperate to escape, Dr. Caldwell turned and ran, but the hall stretched on endlessly, the mirrors and portraits blurring together into a dizzying maze. No matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the ticking, which followed him like a relentless shadow, growing louder with every step. Finally, exhausted and out of breath, he collapsed to the floor. The clock was there, looming over him, its face now showing the time 2 minutes to midnight. He knew then that his time was almost up, that the clock had brought him here to face his inevitable fate. As the clock struck midnight, the mirror shattered and the portraits burst into flames, consuming everything in a blaze of fire and smoke. Dr. Caldwell could only watch in horror as the flames closed in around him, the heat searing his skin. But just as the flames were about to engulf him, the clock's hand stopped and everything froze. The fire, the mirrors, the hall, it all vanished, leaving Dr. Caldwell alone in the darkness. The ticking of the clock now the only sound in the void. For what felt like an eternity, he floated in that darkness, his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. He knew that the clock had spared him for now, but it was only a matter of time before it claimed him for good. And then, without warning, he was back in his workshop, the clock sitting on the table before him, its hands now motionless. The room was quiet, the air still, but the tension remained, a lingering sense of dread that clung to the walls. Dr. Caldwell staggered to his feet, his body trembling with fear. He knew he couldn't keep the clock, it was too dangerous, too powerful, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it either. Instead, He wrapped it in cloth and locked it away in a chest, vowing never to open it again. But the clock was patient, and it knew that eventually someone would find it. Time, after all, was on its side, and it would wait as long as it needed to, biding its time until it could unleash its curse once more. The years passed, and Dr. Caldwell grew old. Haunted by the memories of that night, he avoided clocks, watches, anything that measured time, but he could never escape the ticking that echoed in his mind. It followed him everywhere, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited him. On his deathbed, Dr. Caldwell whispered to his son, telling him of the clock and its curse, begging him to never open the chest. Bury it, he pleaded with his final breath. Bury it deep where no one can find it. His son, who had always dismissed his father's fears as the ramblings of an old man, promised to do as he asked. But after the funeral, curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the chest, his hands trembling with anticipation. The clock was there, just as his father had described, its golden surface now dull and tarnished. But as he lifted it from the chest, he felt a strange energy pulse through him, a sense of power that both thrilled and terrified him. He knew then that his father had been right, that the clock was more than just an old timepiece. It was a gateway, a portal to something far more sinister, something that defied the very nature of time itself. But instead of burying it, the son kept the clock, hiding it away in a safe place, where it could remain undisturbed. He thought he could control it, that he could resist its pull, but the ticking soon began to invade his dreams, whispering to him in the dead of night. And so, the cycle continued, the clock passing from generation to generation, each new owner drawn to its power, each one eventually falling victim to its curse. It became a family secret, a burden passed down through the years, a dark legacy that none could escape. The clock waited, patient as ever, knowing that time was on its side, and as the years turned into decades, and the decades into centuries, the clock remained, ticking away in the shadows, biding its time until it could strike again. For time, after all, is the ultimate weapon, and the clock was its most ruthless agent, a reminder that no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try, you can never escape the relentless march of time.